The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello, and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and with me today is Eric Lombardo. Eric is a conservationist and housing and transit advocate. He is interested in how land use affects everything we do, from where we live to how we move. He works as policy manager at the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, but he's here today in a different capacity to discuss housing and development patterns in Santa Cruz County. Eric is a founding member and a board member of Stronger Santa Cruz, an advocacy group for sustainable urban planning strategies. He studied environmental policy at Northwestern University and worked at the Sierra Club National Headquarters in Oakland before moving to Santa Cruz in 2022 to work for the Land Trust. Eric Lombardo, welcome.
Well, hey, Len. Thanks so much for having me. This is a treat.
It's great to have you here. And full disclosure, I also am a member of the board of Stronger Santa Cruz, and this is how we met. Since I have a background in urban planning and worked as a planner for about 3.5 years of my long career, I'm bound to jump into this conversation with both feet. But I want to start by, asking you questions and get your take on things. Here in California, most of our urban growth has taken place since the 1940s, but parts of the main cities in the Monterey Bay Area predate that growth. And it's very apparent when you walk the older neighborhoods how much more diversity of housing types and architecture there is and of uses, and how many more destinations are available within a short distance. So let's start by talking about this relationship between land use and housing and transportation and infrastructure expense. What do we now understand about those relationships?
Gosh, a big question to start. And I guess another big thing that I'd be remiss not to mention is, hey, it's Juneteenth, and that's certainly something to recognize. And
I want to ask you about that later. So,
awesome. We'll get right to it.
But I want to get an introduction because I think a lot of people, people working in other professions, you kind of take for granted.
Right.
This is the way it is in my city, or, this is what's happening, and may not really be familiar with understanding that has become, in the profession of planning, has become pretty well rooted and researched and backed up by statistics.
Right.
But that even many working planners still seem to be in the dark about, let alone the average citizen. So I wanted to kind of set the context with that.
Yeah, it's a great start. And, I'm not a planner myself. I do policy work, mostly in the conservation and natural resources space, and an interested person always looking to learn more about housing and commercial development and the spaces that we live in every day. And I think something that I've noticed from my time in the East Bay and in Santa Cruz is we seem to be in this habit where development these days is a new subdivision, a new exurb, if you will, an expansion. And it seems to take so much more, both in terms of the permitting process and really just the overall development process to get something approved in the infill context, in the existing urban core. And I think the developers that are doing these new projects, they're not doing it out of any malice or malintent. It's just kind of what our policy landscape encourages us to do. Go to the green space, the area that hasn't been previously developed, and build 200 single family homes. And fortunately in Santa Cruz County, we've established policies dating back to the 70s, Measure J, that has really changed that frame and made it very difficult to build that next exurb and suburb. But as a result, we kind of don't have that new expansion and thankfully don't, to conserve our farms and our parks. But we also are having trouble getting those infill housing developments put together. And as a result, I think we see this housing crisis that everyone's talking about now. So I think that's a place to start, is where development tends to be, and how that plays out in Santa Cruz County, where we've really restricted that.
Yeah. And we've seen this pattern, in many places where you have an exurb built. Essentially, the idea of more development is not to, say, increase density in a city core, but to just add an additional subdivision on its perimeter, which means more roads, more sewer lines, more water lines, and which puts us into an interesting predicament, because we create communities or neighborhoods that are very low density in people, but very high density in infrastructure that has to be maintained by the municipality.
That's right.
And I know Stronger Santa Cruz was really inspired by this national organization, Strong Towns, which has documented thoroughly the problem with getting ourselves these financial liabilities that are long-term in order to get, immediate development or immediate property tax revenue in the short term. And it's turned out to be quite unsustainable. There were recent articles right here in Santa Cruz about the fact that, and this is not new news, but they were looking at the current data for road maintenance in Santa Cruz County. And what many people may not realize is that virtually every city in and county in the state of California, other than the city and county of San Francisco, which is one very dense, highly populated, completely urbanized block at the end of that peninsula, other than that, the city and county of San Francisco, virtually every other city and county has a growing backlog of road maintenance. And this is despite the fact that Senate Bill 1 of whatever year that was, 2018, I believe, has added additional funding for road maintenance throughout the state.
We see those
What
signs.
it's done is it slowed the growth of the backlog, but it's still a growing backlog. No city or county, as I said, with that one exception of San Francisco in the state, has sufficient funds to completely maintain all the roadways that have been built within their jurisdictions over the decades. And so it's an interesting dilemma. And a lot of it is fed by sprawl. So, that's just the financial end. Doesn't even begin to address the issue of our dependence on automobiles for transportation and what that means in terms of energy use and climate change and time caught in traffic and the cost of living and so forth. So, but it's just a little piece of the puzzle. And you've certainly looked at this yourself, in some respect. And of course, the same is, as you mentioned, it also impacts where housing goes.
Right.
Whether people are able to live near where they work, the cost of housing, and the what we get for the tax dollars that we pay. Do you have a sense of, because you've lived in multiple different places? You lived in the Chicago area, you've lived in Oakland, you've lived in this area, and I don't know where else, but you probably have some perspective from the different places you've been.
I do. And I have friends and family in the Chicago area where they don't talk about a housing crisis. They talk about a great quality of living, maybe the winter accepted. And I think, my experience living just north of Chicago in Evanston, and in some ways in Oakland as well, I always found myself living in kind of that missing middle. And that's a term I'd love to unpack and talk a little bit more about with you, Len. Is in Chicago, I was a senior at school, and I was living in a quadplex, 4 units, 2 on each side. And we had 14 people living there. And of course, it's college housing. But then I moved to Oakland and spent several years living in a duplex with an ADU out back. And currently in Santa Cruz, I live near Santa Cruz High, just outside downtown, in an awesome duplex. And what's really interesting about all 3 of those experiences is all of those were in traditionally single-family home neighborhoods. Our neighbors were almost entirely single-family homes, with Chicago a little bit different. And those units that I was able to live in were grandfathered in these R1 or single-family home zoned areas. And I got so much value out of that as someone that couldn't afford to buy a house in Oakland. I can't really afford to buy a house in Santa Cruz County. And I fear that the dialogue and the narrative that we are encountering right now in Santa Cruz County is, okay, where are we going to put that 4-story apartment building? Where are we going to put that 14-story tower? And oh my gosh, how scary. And, whatever your opinions are on those proposals, we also need to make space for those duplexes and those triplexes. And we see opportunities, Senate Bill 9, giving us a chance to take a single family home and divide it into 2 units. And I fear that that's kind of the operationalization of some of these policies are just getting started and maybe going a little bit slowly here at the start. But I'm hopeful with those solutions. And I think that would be a really generative thing for us to move beyond this big tower here, big tower there, and that's it, leave everything else as is, and find that way to build the missing middle and let folks that maybe aren't looking to buy a house or maybe don't have kids yet find that starter home to rent or to buy. And I think nowhere like Santa Cruz County could benefit from that.
Yeah. And I've lived in the Seabright neighborhood of Santa Cruz for many years, and it has a lot of diversity of buildings, that predate the strict zoning rules.
That's right.
So you can go walking down a block, in the Seabright neighborhood, and you'll go by 3 single-family homes, and then a small apartment building with maybe 6 or 8 units, and then another couple single-family homes, and then a duplex. And it's like that just all the way through most of that neighborhood. There's quite a bit of diversity. And then there's been some infill done, where condominium developments were tucked in behind other houses down a driveway, where there used to be a giant lot that once did, I don't know what, maybe they had chicken farm or something, I don't know, but it's obviously the landscape has changed over the decades. But that missing middle is something that we actually see in some of our neighborhoods. And the other interesting thing I'm always puzzled over is when I look at cities that have very much higher density than Santa Cruz area or Monterey area or any of these communities around Monterey Bay, cities that have, in some cases, 6 or 8 or 10 times our population density, and you look at the predominant pattern for housing, and it's 2, 3, and 4 stories of row houses. It's not height that's getting the density. It's that lack of side yards.
Look at San Francisco.
It's the narrowness of streets. And it always puzzles me. You drive down some suburban streets in California where, it's 50 feet curb to curb on a street that gets essentially zero traffic between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And it's like, why do we need this much pavement for this many, for this much traffic when we could have much narrower streets and fit a lot more homes in, or park space or garden space or something? That is just like there's no real public benefit to that much scarcely used pavement. So it's one of the things that I puzzle over and is really striking when you do go to older places. You go to the old district of Boston or parts of San Francisco or older districts. There's even actually a couple neighborhoods in Los Angeles where the streets are very narrow and the houses are packed together, and there's much higher density. It's like, well, we have the space, and in many cases the cities or counties own the space. It's available, and we don't absolutely need that. But I want to move on because particularly today is Juneteenth,
right,
which is commemorating the abolition of slavery in Texas, which was sort of the culmination of enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation that was issued by President Abraham Lincoln. Historically, how has race played a role in land use and in transportation planning?
Oh, it's such a good question, and it's something that I'm still learning about. As I said, I come from kind of the environmental natural resources world. And it's easy to say, well, look at our housing. Everyone can buy a house. It's a fair, level playing field. And the reality is it's everything but. And I think something that we can do on days like today, what is this, the third year that Juneteenth is a federal holiday, is just if you're a white person like myself, or really a person of any identity, is just take the opportunity to use that time, if you're fortunate enough to have the holiday, to educate yourself. And I sat down this morning and I knew a little bit about redlining. I read Color of Law, a great book that I'd highly recommend. And I knew a little bit about racial housing covenants, but I wanted to know more. And something that I looked at was, well, when was Juneteenth? What year are we talking about? We all kind of know 19th century. Well, it was 1865, if my years are right here. And it took almost 100 years, 1948, for a decision at the Supreme Court, I think it was called Shelley versus Kramer, where racially restricted housing covenants were declared unconstitutional. 75, 80, 90 years in between the end of slavery and the opportunity, really, for anyone to be able to buy a home. And if you're not familiar with housing covenants, I got to know them when I was living in Rockridge, a wealthier neighborhood in North Oakland. And you can still see the stone fences and gates behind some of these racially restricted communities they were when they were built around 150 years ago. So these were policies that were actually on deeds of homes that prevented people of non-white identities to buy those houses. And just think about that, 90 years in the meantime. And then, of course, we had the Civil Rights era, and in 1968, the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act, which ended redlining as we know it. And even after that, it took several decades for, I think there was the community redevelopment or credit bill that kind of leveled the playing field for financing and kind of got the banks to do the right thing and offer mortgages to those of kind of lesser income, which are in many cases folks that have not had the chance to generate generational wealth from these kind of ugly histories of our country. And so that was a little journey that I went on. And I think these are things that we're all still learning about. And we meet our neighbors, we walk down the street. The first thing we think about isn't, well, why does it look like this? Who had the opportunity to buy that house when it was built 100 years ago? And those neighborhoods, especially like Seabright, like Rockridge and Oakland, that were built in that time, that did have those policies in place, are in many cases some of the most desirable neighborhoods now and the most unaffordable for folks that, again, don't have the generational wealth. So I think these are the things that I'm trying to put together, and I'm still learning, but I'm hopeful that the awareness is rising. And I think having Juneteenth as a federal holiday is hopefully an opportunity for more people to do that and learn. Housing is so complicated and so complex, and I think we take it for granted sometimes why things are the way they are.
Yeah, well, I think that's sort of the nature of being human, is you kind of assume whatever is happening now is always the way it's been. And,
right.
But it took a lot of historical events to put us where we are. And you mentioned redlining, just that the fact that, you could be in a neighborhood where you couldn't get a loan. If a neighborhood was predominantly or even significantly non-white in the early part of the 20th century, you couldn't get a loan for home improvements. You couldn't get a loan for new construction, and so naturally, those neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that ran down. And today, still, many inner city neighborhoods are the most run down because of that legacy. I mean, everybody knows it's much easier to move get things improved if there's just one house on the street that needs needs its sagging roof rebuilt or needs a new foundation. But if every house on the street needs that, it takes a long time for that to catch up and come around again. So it's an interesting legacy that we have here from race. I grew up in Los Angeles. And when I was a small child, they built the Santa Monica Freeway across what was then sort of the area west of downtown. And, of course, the areas they picked to run the freeway, one of them was a very successful business district where most of the businesses were owned by African Americans. But that was the neighborhood that got picked to place the freeway. And of course, if you get, what do we call it? When the government says we're taking your land.
Oh, eminent domain.
Eminent domain, yeah. So, eminent domain comes along. They tell you, well, your business isn't worth that much because, well, you're an African-American business owner. So here's how much we're giving you for it. Goodbye. And that's the end of it. And so actually destroyed a whole business district that was huge, played a huge role in the vitality of the African-American community in Los Angeles. And, similarly, we've seen, similar patterns in places like Minneapolis, where a freeway bisects an African-American neighborhood that used to have, a lot of street interaction and social stuff. But now there's a freeway there, and you can't just walk over to the neighbors on the other side. There's a freeway in the way. So this has, been repeated across the country scores, if not hundreds of times. And this is, part of our racial, reality in the United States. And you mentioned covenants. Interestingly, there have been, and probably, in more places than LA, but I'm familiar with Los Angeles having grown up there, that for a long time there were covenants against Jews living in most of what's now the central part of Los Angeles, which is why the western part of Los Angeles really got developed, particularly as the movie industry developed, because there were so many Jewish people making a lot of money, and they still couldn't buy a house in the nice, quote, nice neighborhoods of the time, even though they were making lots of money. So thus we have, Westwood and that whole western addition to LA, where there were no such deed restrictions. So we see this manifested, these attitudes of exclusion are manifested in so many ways in so many places. So, but here we are now, and it's 2024. We're facing really a global crisis in regard to climate, but change on the ground is very slow in coming. And there's not so much a shortage of housing in this region, but a shortage of affordable housing. I spoke with someone the other day who said, well, it could also be considered a shortage of income. If people had more money, then they would be able to afford the housing that's there. But the vast majority of new units being built are not going to be affordable to the vast majority of current residents of this area. And what remains of rental housing is being gobbled up by investment companies who have been charging the maximum rent the market will bear. So let's start talking about what can be done to facilitate more affordable housing. And you mentioned the missing middle. So let's get into that. What is that?
Right. Gosh, I'm just going to keep saying it. Missing middle. It's the thing that we don't have here. We go from single family home neighborhoods straight to downtown Santa Cruz, or it's really the same story in Watsonville and in most parts of Mid-County. We have this kind of interesting development pattern where we go straight from really denser neighborhoods, downtowns, apartment complexes, straight into single family. And there's just not a lot in between. And so my understanding of this concept is, well, why is that? And actually, to introduce an even kind of more foundational concept that a lot of folks aren't familiar with, I wasn't until a few months ago, it's traditional development, it's called. Traditional sounds kind of conservative. What does that really mean? And what I've learned is, and really it bears out in history, is that humans have thrived in cities and towns and communities for centuries under this model of a common downtown core. And that core radiates outward. And in between the core and your agricultural areas, your what we call now parks and nature spaces, you have this kind of middle area. It's not quite downtown. It's not quite the far-flung kind of pastoral or more rural areas. And really, those are the places where we want missing middle. We want the housing that's kind of in between the core and the rural areas. And so I learned that that's called traditional development. Never heard of that term until recently. And it just clicked. It made sense. If you look at kind of ancient civilization and even more recent history, that was our development pattern. And then Levittown and kind of the post-World War II housing boom changed all of that, turned into suburbs and exurbs, as we discussed at the start. And so I think intuitively we know that that makes sense. What does this missing middle do for us? It lets a lot of folks live in an area where they can walk around and bike around to get to the things that they need, their work, their groceries, their schools. Right now, we've got a lot of people taking Highway 1 to get to these things. And so missing middle, the idea here is saying, well, we actually have these amazing neighborhoods like Seabright, as you mentioned, where I live just outside of downtown, the kind of area around downtown Watsonville and the neighborhoods there. And we don't need to radically change them. We don't necessarily want to radically change them. People still want to wake up tomorrow and know that they're in Santa Cruz County, this beautiful place by the ocean and the redwoods. But they do want to have a chance to stay here. And I think the affordable question, it can be solved in many ways. And really, we need a lot of different ways to get to the answer here. And some of them are going to be apartment buildings that have a number of affordable units that are prescribed by these policies in terms of what the rents can be. But it also means, taking that 4,000 square foot home, maybe finding a way to put the upper level and the lower level as separate units, like I lived in Oakland, or adding an ADU in back. And I think the beauty of missing middle is it's not a one size fits all. It's not saying, well, everyone's going to live in, a tower, or if you're not living in a tower, you're way out there in the rural areas. It's just giving folks choice and an opportunity to live in something kind of in between. And frankly, I think it also solves for living smaller where possible. I think, I don't have kids personally, so I have the benefit of maybe not needing a huge amount of space, but I've been very well served by the 900 square feet that I live in with my partner. And I think there's just not a lot of options between currently maybe a 700 square foot apartment and a 2,500 square foot home. And
Right.
so this is a choice thing. And it really harks back to society, in the years gone by. And then, of course, as we think of it as a policy matter, it's like passing bills like Senate Bill 9 and really making sure they can actually be operationalized. I know there's been criticism that, well, we passed this great missing middle bill, but there's only a handful of units that actually have permit applications to go through the split, or homes to go through the split into 2 or 3 units. But we're early days, and even understanding that this is a potential solution to the housing affordability problem that can complement the affordable units we're seeing in our apartment building developments. So that's a start. Yeah. What do you think about missing middle, Len?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about it, and the state level has, tried to initiate a lot of things by requiring that cities and counties ease the rules on ADUs. And now, as you mentioned, SB 9, allowing lot splits or additional structures on a property, depending on the size of the property. And, but then, you look at the city of Santa Cruz, the permit fees alone for an ADU can run over $50,000.
Yeah.
Well, that's not going to facilitate very much affordable living space. Construction costs are high right now, but there are places where communities have been very successful in encouraging that. I know some of the strategies that have been used is creating pre-approved plans, that all you have to do is take the pre-approved plan file that is available from the city or county, set it on the drawing of your property, show how it's going to be hooked up, come in, you can get a ministerial approval, like over-the-counter approval, once you have that drawing ready.
Right.
And, put it out to bid and go ahead and build. And these pre-approved drawings also, they've hired architects to try to create these pre-approved designs that fit with the character of the neighborhoods and the cities that they're in. And it's like it kind of conquers 2 goals with one effort of, one, making it easier for people to get permitted to build them, and then making sure that the design of these ADUs or accessory buildings of whatever type they are, really conform to what the city wants to see and what neighbors want to see in their neighborhood. And I've even seen this in a couple cases for some communities on the East Coast of the U.S., where they've also done pre-approved drawings for infill housing, so that if you have, a vacant lot somewhere, bingo, and they even have it set up so, here's the house that's 16 feet wide at its narrow point. Here's the one that's 18 feet. Here's the one that's 20 feet. Here's the one that's 24 feet. So that if your lot constrains the size of the house, you still have a more or less standard design you can just plunk right in. And again, this is over-the-counter approvals. Los Angeles right now is experimenting with expediting permits for developments that have a significant number, and I don't remember the threshold, but a particular percent affordable units in them. And it's been so attractive that builders are flocking to that program and ignoring, regular development opportunities because it saves them so much time. And as we all know, especially if you're getting financing to do anything, it costs money if something takes longer. Plus, it's simplifying their permitting process and expense. So these are some strategies that have worked. But there's much. I'm sure there's much more. But we're going to get into that. But we need to take a really short break, and we'll be right back with more with Eric Lombardo right after this. Don't touch that dial. If you're just joining us, you're listening to Talk of the Bay here on K-Squid. I'm your host, Len B.A., and my guest is Eric Lombardo. He is a conservationist and housing and transit advocate and a founding member and board member of Stronger Santa Cruz, an advocacy group for sustainable urban planning strategies. So, Eric, you're working now for the Land Trust of Santa Cruz, and obviously you know something about how all that works. And the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County is concerned primarily with the conservation of natural environments. But I've discovered that in some cities, especially in the Northeast and Midwest, there are a lot of urban land trusts that rehabilitate, conserve, and build permanently affordable housing. Are you familiar with the housing trust model? Do you think it has any potential here in California?
Gosh, absolutely.
Sorry.
Absolutely. I think, so I've heard them called CLTs, or community land trusts, and I want to dive into that, but I want to briefly also touch on where we left off before, this concept of how do we get stuff built? How do we get stuff permitted easily? And, what you just said, I work at the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County, and while I'm not here on behalf of the organization, I've experienced some really interesting instances where we're working on projects that they're restoration projects, they're habitat restoration. Really, it would be tough to find a person that doesn't want to see that happen in California, especially in Santa Cruz County. And yet we're still going through these incredibly burdensome processes. And as an environmentalist, I've seen all of really the good things that CEQA or the California Environmental Quality Act have done for us. But I've also seen now some of the tougher stuff. It's taken months to get these restoration projects approved. And it's challenging to understand why and to not get frustrated. And the state's doing something about it. They've created this thing called SERP, or statutory exemption for restoration projects, if I think I have it right. And I think what you're describing, where we can take these kind of sample, kind of plug and play ADUs or infill housing projects that can be ministerial, that's great stuff. That's taking the same type of playbook as SERP and saying, you know what, this is a good thing. It's where we want to see the housing. It's going to have these societal benefits, and we still need to make sure that things are done right and things are done appropriately, but let's make it a little bit easier. And I think that's really flipping on its head the story since CEQA. The law has been instituted where sometimes it's harder to actually get stuff permitted and approved in the infill areas. And so I just wanted to touch on that and say I see that in the natural resources world, and I'm hopeful that housing and really the way that we develop our cities can take a page out of that book. And then on the CLT front, you're right to say they are kind of different models than what we call maybe conservation land trust or what the Land Trust of Santa Cruz County does. But I think that there's great promise in taking this similar model of land ownership and bringing it into the cities. And while I don't personally have experience with these community land trusts that are doing housing-based land purchasing and ownership, what I do know about them is that they're focusing on preservation, and they're focusing on taking existing structures and really existing land in these urban cores and saying, there's value there. And that value is not being captured by kind of the free market. And if we can take either a vacant property or a property that's had a home on it, but maybe is at risk of being razed, and we can actually purchase that as a nonprofit land trust and offer it. I think that the typical model is they'll offer it for kind of the same way that an affordable housing application might work for someone that's looking to purchase a home but maybe doesn't have the income level, and say, well, hey, we're a nonprofit land trust that buys housing and offers it to community. We're going to get you in that housing, and you may not actually accumulate the equity of the house for maybe 10 or 15 years. But if you can, you stay there and that house works for you, there's maybe a handoff point where they can start to accumulate equity. And I think these are great ideas and really new solutions that I think we need more of. And I believe there are a few CLTs in California, these community land trusts that are up and running. And I'd love to contribute to one. Actually, just heard from Elaine Johnson, Housing Santa Cruz County's executive director, at an event during Housing Month, ask us, hey, why not a CLT? Maybe we could do this here. And I think that's a great idea. Of course, the financing and the kind of the startup cost to create a CLT organization versus an advocacy organization is a lot different. But I think we need both of those things. We need our advocates and our folks that are really interacting with purchasing and making homes available, these things that have these higher capital costs.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know Oakland actually has a community land trust. I think it's so far fairly limited in assets, but
they've done a few deals. Yeah, I think they have maybe 10. Can't say for sure, but at least a few examples where folks are actually living in those houses. And the question is, does that solve the housing crisis? Well, of course not. But we don't think about the climate crisis that way necessarily. We think about many solutions coming together and kind of turning our corner in the climate context. And I think we should do the same in housing.
Yeah. And there's been proposals, well, both here in Santa Cruz and places like Los Angeles and a number of other cities for ways to generate revenue for affordable housing, such as, vacancy taxes, things like that, which can fund community land trusts. And that's really it. It's like the really big ones, the ones that own significant numbers of properties, started a long time ago. And of course, they got, a good head start before prices got as high as they are. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. I mean, for the price of a jet fighter or, a few dozen bombs, we could have literally millions or billions of dollars on hand to do that kind of work, to create opportunities for people to actually become homeowners, even if they're low income. And I want to pivot to parking. We have a lot of rules about parking, typically minimum parking requirements for each and every type of development.
Right.
The state has curtailed that at the state level and said you can't create minimum parking requirement for an ADU, for example. So they've removed that hurdle. But we're seeing situations where, if someone wants to build a 8-unit apartment building, the cost of the parking, providing the minimum parking requirement for that building, is equivalent to the cost of 2 or 3 of those units, of the living units. And granted, you say, well, where are the cars going to go if you don't have it? But if you have housing located in places where there is easy access to transit, or it really is feasible to do most of your weekly trips by bicycle or on foot, then, why not? And it's not like you're saying you can't put in parking, but it allows the builder to say, oh, in order to sell these or to rent these, whatever it is, I need to provide a certain amount of parking. Let them make that determination rather than the city saying, oh, well, you've got to have, 2.3 parking spaces per bedroom, it doesn't really make sense, and it adds a lot to the cost. And it also obviously uses up a lot of valuable space, because what do we have a premium on? It's land. So I know that Stronger Santa Cruz is advocating for removal of parking minimums, and not necessarily just in transit corridors, but in a lot of places. How do you see this, and what are all the impacts of these parking requirements?
Right. Well, first of all, I think there's maybe a misconception that removing parking mandates means that there won't be any more parking with any new proposals. And I think you're speaking to that point a little bit, Len. And what you said is, well, gosh, the free market's probably still going to put a price on parking and value it and provide it in some degree. I think there are some projects right now, the food bin project comes to mind, where they aren't proposing parking, except for maybe a handicap spot or two. And that has really gotten the community riled up. And folks, I live a block or two away from that project, and I've heard it from my neighbors, that same thing that you're saying. Where will people park? Where am I going to park? And I think it's kind of this red herring where folks get so worked up that the whole thing just becomes this black and white issue, this awful project versus the neighborhood that's fighting it. And so I think parking kind of brings that emotionality for whatever reason. I think mostly because our society in California especially is built around the car. But at the same time, I really do think if we reduce the mandates for parking, even if we lower it rather than eliminate it, we're still going to see developments, especially ones that are not like the food bin, which is primarily studios targeting students that tend not to have cars compared to the average family. We're still going to see new developments that are proposing parking in an appropriate scale. And I think on the flip side of an appropriate scale of parking is it's something that Strong Towns, the national organization, does every year. It's I think they call it the Black Friday parking count or something like that. They'll go out to these, maybe the Capitola Mall would be a good example. Place with just a ton of parking for whatever reason. It was built, post World War II, whatever. It's a Home Depot, and these advocates, these volunteers, will go to these places on Black Friday, the day that there should be the most people there and the most cars parked in these stores, and they're still seeing vacancies 30%, 40%. And we've all seen this. We've all taken that awkward walk from maybe a side street that you parked on through a parking lot to get to wherever you're going, and you kind of laugh at yourself. But maybe you should also laugh at the ridiculousness of the situation that we have these giant spaces. As you say, land is one of our really most important assets, especially in a place like Santa Cruz County, where we've made a values-based decision not to develop in our wildlands and in our agricultural areas. And so I think it's common sense to want to reduce the amount of unused parking that we're seeing while maintaining at least some of it where it is appropriate. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping for that nuance. I'm hoping that we can create spaces and organizations and really people and leaders that can speak to that nuance and kind of turn the dial down a little bit on parking. Based on my food bin experience, I don't think we're there yet. But I think there's a space for it, and I'm hoping that Stronger Santa Cruz can find some space there and really advocate for fewer parking spots, maybe if we don't eliminate them all.
Yeah. I lived for a short time in San Francisco in the early 90s, and the place I was staying was about a half a block from the N. Judah streetcar line. But typical of San Francisco housing, like the place I was living in was one of 3 flats in a single building, each with its own entry. And that entire building had one off-street parking space. And these were 3-bedroom flats, 3 of them, 3-bedroom flats with one off-street parking space. This does not meet any modern standard of minimum parking requirements. And sure enough, for one thing, a good day for me, because I did have to have a car there, was I was able to park on my own block. That would be 1 out of 4 times. Most of the time I would be parking 2 to 3 blocks away, and that was just the nature of the beast. For one thing, it's a wonderful incentive to use transit when it's like that.
Right.
I was able-bodied, so it wasn't it wasn't a real hurdle. It was just slightly inconvenient, but it certainly made it motivating to try to do as many trips as possible without using the car. And that's typical of a lot of older cities, and certainly places like San Francisco. As anybody knows who's just gone there for a day trip or an overnight, parking your car can cost nearly as much as a hotel room used to cost. It's an interesting dynamic where we take for granted, oh yeah, we should have absolute convenience for storing our automobiles wherever we go, but convenience for using transit or using bicycles is not taken for granted. Or even walking is not taken for granted. In fact, if you go somewhere where you have to walk, across 2 parking lots to get to where you're going because you're on foot, that inconvenience isn't counted somehow. But if you didn't have the parking right next to the front door of the place you're going, it's a big deal. So kind of upside down priorities in an era when I'll say the system of automobile transportation is proving it's completely unsustainable. And I don't mean just the gasoline going into gas-powered cars. I mean all of the resources going into mining, manufacturing, and using up land space for a system of transportation that is clearly cannot be carried out universally around the world without destroying the earth to do it. So we have some options to explore, and maybe we'll get there. Transportation planners tend to look at mobility from the perspective of our current patterns of movement. But when we step outside that box, we can begin to consider why people travel from one place to another, and how to create new relationships between places so that motorized movement could be reduced. Maybe walking and cycling could become sufficient for more or even most of our daily trips. So how do you see housing and land use decisions and their effect on our dependence on motorized transportation?
Wow, gosh, it's everything. It's everything. I know I have the good fortune of biking to work. It's maybe 10 minutes. I'm really not a cyclist beyond biking to work. That's how I use my bicycle. And I have colleagues at the Land Trust that are ardent environmentalists and strong believers in reducing their personal impact on the environment. And just because they happen to live, in South County or in Felton, they're in the car every day, and many of them are battling traffic. And I think about the next unit of housing that we're building, and the next store that's going to open, and the next street that's getting repaved. And what can we do to increase the kind of the livability of all of those decisions, really regardless of if it's a housing development or a street getting a bike lane or a new store that's opening that's dealing with parking requirements, or a church for that matter. And I think we have to revisit our values and think about what we want. Another interesting analogy that I've been thinking about is kids these days get shuttled from after-school activity to after-school activity in a car in many cases, and aren't playing outside and on their bicycle going from place to place. And I understand parents thinking, well, shoot, the cars are going so fast. I don't want to send my kid on a bicycle. And I was in that situation. I grew up in a suburb in New England where you weren't even allowed to ride your bicycle to the high school. It was a policy. You couldn't do it. The cars on the street leading up to the school were going 40, 45 miles an hour, and they had an injury. And I never thought of this as anything out of the ordinary until I moved to the Chicago area, and everyone, it seemed like, was riding a bicycle. And I realized, gosh, the solution at my high school was no one rides a bike, not reduce the speed limit. And so I think if we take some of these things for granted, and I laugh now, but these are real meaningful things that impact our lives every day, whether we're a school teacher, a clerk at a store, a scientist. No matter what, we all have to be moving from place to place. And I think often land use is this question of where we build our houses, what do we kind of save, quote unquote, for nature. And there's this middle ground of movability that is really meaningful. And I've experienced this firsthand recently going through Arana Gulch in Santa Cruz. I use it all the time to get from kind of where I live near downtown over to, Live Oak, Capitola. And I learned recently it took, gosh, maybe you know this, Len, like 15 years for that thing to maybe longer, for that all to come together.
Yeah, from the first it was proposed, I think it was more like 20.
And it's just remarkable. And I know there's an endangered plant there, the Santa Cruz tar plant, and there's really good reasons for why we needed to do this really thoughtfully. But man, looking back on it, I get so much value out of having the opportunity to take that trail and feel, 10 times safer than biking on Soquel. And so I choose that mode of transit as you said, as an able-bodied person. And so I just hope as we go forward, we think about the broader context. And it's not so much, okay, there's a path through a park. What does that mean? It actually meaningfully changes people's behavior. And land use generally meaningfully changes people's behavior. And all too often, I think we just accept it rather than want to change it. And I think that was the impetus of you and me and John and Alexis and Brian and Ethan and the folks that are starting Stronger Santa Cruz to get together and say, hey, we can change things. This is something that matters. And I know there are a lot of other great housing and transit organizations out there. And I hope that we can come together and work on these things from a people and a values place primarily.
Yeah. Yeah. And while we're on the subject, can you tell listeners, I know there's an Instagram page for Stronger Santa Cruz. Can you tell listeners how to find that?
Oh, I'd love to. This is always ironic as a non-Instagram user myself, but I think it's Stronger Santa Cruz, no dashes, no dots. You can also go to strongersantacruz.org, which redirects right there to the Instagram. It's a place where we're trying to get our message and communications out. We formed as an advocacy group this year, just a few months ago. So we're really just starting out, but it's a place to get a sense for what matters to us as an organization as we build and connect with other organizations and meet with our elected officials and our stakeholders. And I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah, and I know there will be, links, over time to other resources, articles. But if you're intrigued about the ideas of what we like to call new urbanism, but there's many names for this. You might check out strongtowns.org, which is the national organization Strong Towns. And there are a number of others, but I'm going to just limit it to two others. Another is called originalgreen.org, which is really about, they talk about the owner of that website who is does a lot of teaching and work in planning and architecture, talks about how we tend to think of green as what he calls gizmo green, new technologies like, electric cars and solar panels and so forth. But that he says, of course, as you were talking about, traditional design or traditional neighborhoods, the solutions were already built in. And as he said, these are things that our great-grandparents all knew by heart, which we seem to have lost touch with. So originalgreen.org has a number of very interesting write-ups and even some videos and audio stuff. And another one I want to just mention, because we have this interesting problem with transportation planning and especially transportation funding in the U.S., where it's very fragmented. And there is not a coherent transportation strategy for the nation as a whole, or even for the state as a whole. There's often, local governments working at cross purposes to the state, who's working at cross purposes to the federal, and within the federal government, they'll get one policy, on paper on the law books, but they can't get the budget to match that policy objective. And so we see that a lot, but an organization that does some wonderful analysis and advocacy around that work is Transportation for America, and their website is T4America.org, T4America.org, and really you can get a real quick primer on what's working and what isn't when it comes to transportation from them. So I wanted to share those. We have just a couple of minutes left. And so, Eric, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about any other aspect of these issues that you think you'd like to have our listeners leave with today to reflect on and maybe take with them the next time they're talking to their representatives in local government?
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks, Len. I think this is a great time to just appreciate the space you're creating here to talk land use, housing, the way we go about our daily lives outside the context of a development proposal that has a public meeting, outside the context of a state bill that kind of has folks lining up on the pro and the anti side. I think just sitting down and talking to your friends, maybe it's your representatives, maybe it's just around the dinner table about these things, and really being aware that we have the ability to make change here is a perfect start. And really, I think housing, especially locally, has become this kind of boogeyman topic. It's everywhere and it's nowhere, and it feels like no one can do anything, and sometimes it gets really emotional. And I think we have an opportunity, I hope we have an opportunity to think about these things in a positive frame. And I'm hopeful that the organization Stronger Santa Cruz can do that and speak to the future, what we want our kids to be able to do when they're hopefully living in Santa Cruz County in a few decades. And so the thing that I really want to emphasize is that housing isn't a black and white issue. It's not necessarily the tower versus no tower. And I'm a supporter of dense housing primarily, but I think most people want something probably somewhere in between, and they don't necessarily know where to go right now to have that conversation. And if you don't have language around it, but you just feel a certain way, that's okay. You can express that opinion and say, hey, it would be awesome if I could walk to my grocery store, maybe go a couple times a week rather than once a week or once a month in my car and load it up, and just think about these things from how you experience going about your daily life. It's something that I've been trying to do. It's just understand the decisions that I'm making and why I'm making them, and maybe why I'm in the good fortune of being able to bike to work and bike to the beach, for example. And we really want more people to be able to do that, especially in summertime when it feels like traffic builds up in every corner of Santa Cruz and really the whole county. So I think I want to just share that positive framing. We have some ideas, some solutions, and let's work on them together. And if you want to work on them with us, you can reach out to me, Eric at strongersantacruz.org, old school email. Would love to hear from you and plug you in with what we're doing. I think it's an opportunity to get involved in a positive way.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening, and thank you, Eric Lombardo, for being here on Talk of the Bay.
Hey, thanks, Len.